Flagship phones today are wild. They are thinner, lighter, faster, packed with AI features and insanely expensive. But here's the thing, not everyone wants or needs the latest flagship. Sometimes the smarter move is to look back a few years to a phone that used to be the best you could buy, but now costs about as much as a mid-range device. That's exactly where the iPhone 14 Pro Max sits in 2025. It's launched in late 2022 as Apple's absolute top-tier model. 3 years later, it's not new anymore, but it's still holding on surprisingly well. So instead of treating this like a nostalgia piece, let's actually look at it in today's context. How does it feel to use? What's aged well? What hasn't? And most importantly, is it worth buying now? The first thing you noticed when you pick up the iPhone 14 Pro Max is just how premium it feels. Stainless steel frame, frosted glass back, it screams high-end. But along with that comes the weight. At around 240 grams, this is not a light phone. You will feel it in your pocket, and you will definitely notice if you are trying to use it one-handed for longer than a few minutes. Some people love that solid, heavy feel. It makes the phone feel more durable, more serious. Others find it a bit tiring compared to the lighter titanium builds of today's flagships. Either way, it's part of the phone's identity. And since it's such a large device, the display becomes the star of the show. The 6.7-inch OLED panel is still a beauty. You get rich contrast, bright HDR playback, and Apple's ProMotion 120Hz refresh rate, which keeps everything looking silky smooth. Watching videos, scrolling through apps, even just swiping through photos, it all looks and feels polished. Sure, the bezels aren't as razor thin as the latest models, but once you start using it, that disappears into the background. What stands out instead is the size and smoothness of the screen. It still feels flagship even 3 years later. Performance is often where older phones start to show their age, but the 14 Pro Max holds up better than you would expect. Inside is Apple's A16 Bionic chip. Now this chip isn't topping benchmark charts anymore, but benchmarks don't tell the whole story. Day to day, it still feels fast. Apps launch without hesitation, and games, even graphically intense ones, are more than playable. The real magic is how the software and hardware work together. Apple's control over iOS means that animations, transitions, and gestures stay fluid even years later. You swipe up to go home, you jump between apps, you scroll through long web pages, and it all feels refined, almost effortless. If I handed this phone to someone who didn't know its release year, I doubt they would guess it was 3 years old. And that seamlessness makes moving into the camera and media experience feel natural. The cameras were one of the big upgrades back in 2022, and even now they hold their own. The main sensor is 48 megapixels, and it still delivers crisp, detailed shots in good lighting. Colors are balanced and natural. Apple leans toward realism rather than oversaturation, which makes photos look timeless rather than trendy. Portrait mode remains very usable, edge detection is accurate in most cases, and the background blur feels organic, not artificial. The front camera, meanwhile, continues to impress with true-to-life skin tones and decent handling of tricky lighting, like backlit conditions where a lot of mid-range phones still struggle. Low light is where you notice the gap between this and modern AI-heavy phones. Night mode keeps images usable, exposure is solid, noise is under control, but it's not as sharp or dramatic as today's computational photography tricks. Still, if you are not zooming in at pixel level, it's more than good enough. Where the iPhone 14 Pro Max really shines is video. Apple has always led the pack here, and the phone still feels reliable. Stabilization is excellent, you can walk or pan without things turning jittery. Colors and detail look natural, audio capture is clear, and honestly, for vlogging and casual filming, it's still one of the best tools you can have in your pocket. The newer iPhones might autocorrect reflections or brighten shadows using AI, but the iPhone 14 Pro Max delivers consistent results. And for many people, that's actually a plus. You get what you shoot and it looks realistic. Beyond cameras and performance, what makes this phone feel premium are the little details that you interact with constantly. The haptic feedback is still some of the best in the industry. Typing on the keyboard feels sharp and precise. Toggling switches gives you satisfying little clicks, and scrolling carries subtle tactile feedback. It may sound minor, but after using it for a while, you realize how much it adds to the overall experience. The buttons hold up too. Power, volume, and that signature mute switch, they still have a firm, clicky response. No mushiness, no wobble. It's the kind of detail you don't notice until you use a phone that doesn't get it right. Audio is another strength. The stereo speakers still sound rich, with enough volume to fill a room for casual listening. Voices in calls are clear, music has surprisingly depth for a phone, and even outdoors the sound holds up well. Microphones are also consistent. You won't hear muffled or distant audio in voice notes or FaceTime calls. Face ID is just as instant as it was on launch day. Whether you're unlocking from an angle, in bright sunlight, or with the phone flat on a desk, it just works, and the predictability makes it invisible in daily life. You stop thinking about unlocking altogether. Charging is slower by today's standards, around an hour and a half for a full charge, but the battery itself is still reliable. With normal use, it gets through a day comfortably. Heavy users might need a quick top up in the evening, but it doesn't feel like the phone is dying too quickly. And then there's the everyday feel. The weight, the smoothness of the glass, the precision of gestures, it all combines into a sense of quality. That's something mid-range devices often miss, and it's part of why the 14 Pro Max still feels like a flagship. Apple's support is one of the main reasons this phone remains a smart buy. The iPhone 14 Pro Max is still getting major iOS updates and security patches, meaning it doesn't feel abandoned. A lot of Android flagships from 2022 have already stopped receiving updates or will very soon, but Apple track record suggests this iPhone still has several years left. That's what really extends its value. It doesn't just run smoothly now, it'll keep running smoothly for a while. Of course, it's not perfect. Compared to 2025 flagship, there are things that feel dated. There's no on-device AI for smart photo fixes or real-time voice transcription. The dynamic island, the little interactive cutout at the top, was exciting at launch, but today it feels less futuristic or more like a neat, if slightly underused feature. And depending on which version you pick up, you might still be dealing with a lightning port instead of USB-C. That's a big inconvenience if you have moved your other devices to the newer standard. But here's the key, none of these things break the experience. They are noticeable, but they don't ruin what the phone does well. The fundamentals, screen, performance, cameras, reliability are still there. If you are the kind of person who chases the newest features, the latest AI tricks, the thinnest bezels, the fastest charging, this isn't the phone for you. But if you want something that feels premium, takes good photos, runs smoothly, and will stay supported for a few more years, the iPhone 14 Pro Max is a really strong option. So would you still pick one up today, or do you think 3 years is already too long in phone years? Personally, I think for the right buyer, the iPhone 14 Pro Max makes a lot of sense. It's proof that you don't always need the latest flagship. Sometimes yesterday's flagship is still the smarter choice.